Right, so basically I think we are looking upon an admission that two-tier justice exists from the government. And
it's very safe to say because they've
They've
been all
even
but
agreed it.
explicit about it, haven't they?
they have been explicit about it, but also they always said that people who use these words are far-right extremists. So the
The government's now a far-right extremist.
it has a,
Same Shabima Mahmoum is that far right, but now she's an extremist far right rather than just being an extremist in some people's minds.
right. So basically, the Sentencing Council for England and Wales has issued some guidelines with respect to sentencing that take ethnicity into account to an extent that was presumably that's much greater than the extent it was taken before.
It's also worth mentioning that it was already quite bad.
Yes.
Like you could just eyeball sentences reading the news, being, you know, a casual reader of a newspaper, and you could see the differences in sentencing pretty explicitly. You know, the reason everyone noticed this two-tier thing was largely through what they'd seen through headlines, and now the fact that the Sentencing Council's just explicitly admitting it is very significant.
Yes, and I may infuriate you because I don't think that they have particular credibility, but the Labour government says that these guidelines are unacceptable because they support a two-tier system.
Yeah.
Wait, what?
This is a Labour government saying it doesn't support a two-tier system when almost
Exactly.
across every aspect of policy and government, it is creating a two-tier
Not on their watch. Not on their watch.
Well,
So-
this is oh, sorry, Steph.
No, please.
This is certainly some red meat to poach from the right, isn't it?
Yes,
Well-
and also Keir Starmer has started talking about illegal migration and him being particularly unhappy with it. He's not talking about irregular migration, he's talking about illegal.
I think he's had a meeting with Tony Blair because he's been saying, I hear your concerns and I'm taking them seriously, which is like a signature Tony line.
Right. So for me, this shows that there is a significant trend within the world of jurisprudence of judging according to these principles. And right now, they felt that this is the opportune moment to come and provide additional institutional backing and support for these principles when they're saying that with these guidelines, we want you, judges, to adjudicate according to these principles. And essentially, this is going to say, it's going to mention the oppression calculus, and they're going to give some reports to the judges, especially when it comes to people of ethnic background. And they're going to try to say that because there are several oppressed minorities and ethnicities, all this implicit bias should be taken into account when you're yielding a verdict about the sentence, and perhaps you should be a bit more lenient with so-called oppressed backgrounds.
It's also worth mentioning as well that the research on implicit bias in psychology seems to suggest that you can't get rid of it, but if you do take measures to try to, it makes your racial bias worse, yes. In that, for example, they exposed people to stereotypes and terminology to avoid, and what it did was it made people more easily recall these terms that they're not supposed to use, which probably means they're more likely to use them.
And the more biased people are, the more necessary the anti-bias section seems to be, at least to people who think that bias is wrong. Right, so we have an article from The Guardian here that says ministers criticize two-tier sentencing changes in England and Wales, and they're saying is the guidance aimed at tackling bias and reducing reoffending. How exactly? Puts more emphasis on the need for pre-sentence reports, which give details of the offender's backgrounds, motives, and personal life before sentencing. So my question is, what does this do that the ordinary defense doesn't do?
Well, the ordinary defense comes out and gives you, as a barrister myself, someone who's had to go through the criminal process, both as a prosecutor and as a defender, is the ability for the defense to raise the issues that support why you shouldn't be sentenced so determinedly. If you talk about what happened in your family background, you talk about breakups, you talk about the lack of education you have, you might talk about why you were threatened. All of those are elements that you would normally and naturally use. The whole process of the pre-sentence report, when it was created, was to try and ensure that those defendants who were incapable of doing it properly, or to give an opportunity for the court to understand more about an individual, that was created. And to an extent, someone often argued why. Why was this brought in? Now, I can understand it. In many cases, a pre-sentence report was actually helpful to be able to understand what was going on. And I think for many, many lawyers, they would say a PSR is a useful vehicle. The first question is kind of philosophically, why was it introduced when you could do this anyway? And why did the courts not listen to what the defendants? And I think really it was because the courts were being encouraged not to imprison people or give certain sentences to certain groups of people. And they couldn't just rely on the defense. They wanted to have a third party. It was like the idea of bringing in quangos. If we can rely on a third party, it's not your fault you didn't do it properly. And it's not us. We're just listening to the pre-sentence report. And that's why this is taking on such an important part of the debate, is because judges and magistrates are almost washing their hands to a certain extent by saying, I'm relying on what's said in the pre-sentence report.
So I think, sorry, Stelios. I think the way a lot of ordinary people think about justice is that it doesn't necessarily matter about these sort of extenuating circumstances. A certain action should have a certain sentence, regardless of your reasoning for it. I think that's how I certainly think about that sort of thing. And it seems like a way of basically making excuses for yourself. Maybe I'm being a bit unsympathetic here, but it does seem like a way of saying, oh, well, I came here on a small boat. It was terrible. It was awful. I've had such a hard time now. I'm really sorry about stabbing that innocent person.
Yes. So my question, I think I'll phrase it again. What does this put forward that a traditional defense doesn't? Because you're mentioning the specifics of the case, which I'm sure the defense would mention. But it seems to me that in this report, if the report is about to say tackling bias, they are going to put forward all the ideological bits. All the woke progressivism within legislation is going to get an extra institutional backing. And let me continue what they say. Under the change, which would come into force on April the 1st, tomorrow, that is. Magistrates and judges would be asked to consult a pre-sentence report before determining whether to imprison someone of an ethnic or religious minority, as well as young adults, abuse survivors, and pregnant women. At present state, black and minority ethnic communities are overrepresented at almost all stages of the criminal justice process in England and Wales, and are more likely to be imprisoned and receive longer sentences than white people. Well, the question why isn't being asked here, but also what is going to happen is that these guidelines are saying we are going to have the woke oppression calculus. We're going to separate the population into groups. We're going to rank them according to who is more or less oppressed. And those who are considered to be among the privileged groups are going to get tougher sentences. This is precisely what this is.
It's an explicit rejection of the rule of law, isn't it?
Yeah. Right, so Keir Starmer took issue with it, and he took issue with several other things. He talked today about illegal migration as being a risk for security, and him being very angry about it. He's also very angry about the two-tier system. Right, so let's look at what Keir Starmer has to say here.
Well, I'm disappointed in this response, and the Lord Chancellor is obviously continuing to engage on this, and we're considering our response. All options are on the table, but I am disappointed at this outcome, and now we'll have to consider what we do as a result.
So he's gravely disappointed.
But he's come out just was it just before we came on air, where he actually said now we're going to push an initial legislation to attach to current amendments. He's putting an amendment to current legislation in order to try and tackle this issue. How he does that. So he's saying he cares, but I think this is a lot of pressure. As you saw when we were discussing the letter about it, the letter makes it very clear that it's all about what the pressure has come from Robert Jenrick. No one else. Just Jenrick seems to have caused this. And I think he's running a bit scared.
Speaking of Robert Jenrick, we have a post of him here saying under two-tier Keir, that's exactly what's happening. It's completely outrageous. This would enshrine an anti-white and anti-Christian bias in our criminal justice system.
Sounds about right to me, to be honest.
Yes, and he's reacting against Shabana Mahmood, who said there will never be a two-tier sentencing approach under this Labour government.
Well, it's too late for that now, isn't it?
Yeah, I don't know. Do you believe them?
No.
Just tell us in the comments. Tell us in the live chat. Do you believe them? Right. So she is proposing here a way to tackle this. The government will introduce legislation to Parliament this week to override independent guidance on how offenders from ethnic minorities should be sentenced. It comes after the Sentencing Council refused a request from Justice Secretary Shabana Mahmood to consider its new instruction for judges. I know I just don't believe
it's going to be a fascinating element because, as I say, for many lawyers, a PSO, a pre-sentence report, is useful. But in so many ways, the idea that it's now here's a judge or a magistrate. We are considering incarcerating somebody, but because they come from one of these three groups, or four if you've added a couple more on there as well, we can't sentence them to prison today because we've got to get a PSO. And why I can't understand why the judiciary or those who are looking at this see this as odd, because what do I go back to we were trying to make jokes about it, but the reality was my grandparents worked in factories, pretty abused in factories in the 90s and 1900s, and their ancestors were all abused. They were pretty much slaves, working for virtually nothing. The miners' families were the same. All over Britain, we could turn around and say we've had abuse from elitist masters who've taken our labour and used it to build their empires and big houses. Why are they excluded? Haven't they got some sort of cultural or historical pain that we remember? We remember what it's like to be in poverty. In the 70s and the 80s, well, maybe not for you guys, to be honest, you're far too young and healthy compared to myself. But we do know what it was like when the lights were out in the 80s. And so why is that excluded as a characteristic that should be considered when I'm doing the crime? And I think that's the real point that's going to impact people in this country about fairness. We're a nation of fairness, and we want to see it being fair to everyone all the time.
Speaking of fairness, it's one thing to talk about fairness in the abstract concept, because everyone will go out and say, we are fair. Yeah. No, I'm not having a go at you.
No, it's true. You're absolutely right.
I want to improve, to add to what you're saying. The question is how fairness is being understood. So the Aristotelian, for instance, understanding of fairness is completely different to the woke understanding of fairness. The woke understanding of fairness wants to institute differential treatment. Why? Because they say, well, until we are in the position to treat people equally, we are in a state of emergency and we need to mitigate historical inequalities, and we need to help those who have been historically oppressed.
Sorry.
Yeah,
go ahead.
No, just to finish, but the way that they are understanding who is oppressed or not, as you mentioned, is entirely arbitrary, which lends supports to the view that what they care about is not fairness. What they care about is who is their political friends and who are their political enemies. They want to benefit the former, harm the latter.
I think a rather oft overlooked point here is that there's a massive amount of hubris here in the notion that they've got a complete understanding of basically human suffering. They're basically trying to mitigate for the fact that some people have not had the best shot at life. Yeah. And to make these formal judgments saying, okay, these ethnicities, they've had a particularly bad time, but other people perhaps not. White people, you know what, they've had an easy ride of it. And as you've alluded to, that's not true. And the arrogance at play here to say that, oh, you know what, these people who have come over and claimed welfare and not worked, they're more persecuted than someone who's worked their entire life for effectively the state. I see such a mismatch here, but that's not going to be acknowledged, is it? Because they think that they understand the nature of human suffering, which they don't.
And I think that's an incredibly important point to ignore what's happened as culturally to people in this country as they've tried to make their lives better. I mean, you suddenly reminded me of a kind of story that I had as a junior barrister. I spent my first year, I'd prosecuted and defended and not lost a single criminal case in the first year. So as a consequence of that, I was taken to a bar around the corner from the criminal justice main courts, and it was Benjamin Stillingfleet's, I think it was called. I'm not sure it's still there anymore. And I was introduced to one of the greatest barristers of his time, George Carman, by my pupil master, as we called him, and he goes to George in his very posh voice. George, I'd like to introduce you to another Mancunian like yourself, who's done incredibly well. He's great at the bar in crime. And George Carman turns around to look at me, and he's surrounded by a whole group of people, all fawning all over this great barrister. And he says, "What's your name?" Again, equally in a posh. And I said, and I still had my Manc accent. I said, "It's Stephen Wolfe from Manchester." Although I'm probably sounding Scouse now at the moment. I'm going to get killed by my family for doing that. And he turns around to me, and his only words to me were, "If you want to go far at the bar, lose that accent, boy. Lose that accent." And that kind of privilege and the voice is doing you down because of where you came from. That's the sort of level of suffering that we've had from those who've had to work in the pits to those who've tried to climb out. Does that count? Is that going to be ignored?
Yes.
And I think that you're right. It will be ignored because it's not relevant to their agenda.
Exactly. I think it has to do a lot with the left turning its back to the traditional working class. I think Lenin himself said that unless there's a vanguard party that is going to tell the workers what their true interests are, they're going to develop at most a syndicalist consciousness, and they're going to choose capitalism, not communism. And after I think when the more communism got discredited, and actual socialism got discredited, the left started focusing on in the 60s in universities. And then I think they're in a position, right, where they say we've lost the native working class, so they're going to opt for foreign people.
And your point is incredibly proven with the statistics that came out over the weekend that showed that when you look at the particular parties' support, Labour is now being supported by the wealthiest individuals in this country, at the higher end, the middle-aged groups, and those who've gone to university. So they're saying that Labour supports the rich and the clever. I mean, to be honest, I wouldn't necessarily say that everybody who went to university is clever, but there we go.
Yeah, from my experience,
it's certainly the case. But they love that, and that feeds into this arrogance of a kind of a snobbish kind of view, looking down upon those below me who don't understand the issues. And I find that patronizing. And it's exactly what your point is raised on that.
Thanks. So I think there are two interpretations of what is going on here. The first, which I find completely unlikely, is that Labour actually has an issue with the two-tier justice system, which I don't think it's particularly credible as a hypothesis. And the second one is that basically they are in bed with them. And they are trying to... And the question there becomes, why are they doing so? Well, part of it is because they want to approach elements of the other voters, groups of voters they think they have alienated. That's why we see Keir Starmer starting banging the drum of anger against illegal migration right now. So what they could be doing is working together, having people within the judiciary proposing, basically discrediting the judiciary within, in the eye of the public mind. That's in public consciousness, pardon me. And that makes people being much more prone towards government control, extra government control, because they say, well, look at the judiciary, all of them are crazy and they are harming society. So the only way to solve this is by erasing the checks and balances that the judiciary poses to the government and opt for a much stronger executive. In which case, the question is, what are we going to make of... Wait, where is the link? I don't have... Well, I don't have the link there. It's not there, but it doesn't matter. Keir Starmer has kneeled before for the BLM cause. He has expressed sympathy for all the woke causes. We've talked extensively about two-tier policing, reporting, and sentencing here. You can just... The examples are too many. You can just click on any video of this link to where we're talking about the two-tier. But
I mean, we did a lot, didn't we?
Yeah, but what I will say is that apart from individual examples, the whole issue is any person who supports woke progressivism is supporting a two-tier society. Because woke progressivism is all about mitigating so-called historical inequalities by means of differential treatment.
So,
Differential treatment means two-tier treatment. So if one is promoting wokeness, one is promoting differential treatment and two-tier society.
I think Starmer's doing two things simultaneously. He's, as you say, empowering the government over the judiciary, but he's also stealing Nigel Farage's two best talking points. He's basically taking immigration and the two-tier justice system, both of which I think ordinary people can see with their own eyes are massive problems, and he's sort of containing them. He's taking the steam out of the sails to try and tank reform in the polls, because at the minute they're a real threat to Labour, aren't they?
I think it's interesting he's doing this just before the local elections, where those local elections that have been permitted to go ahead, which feeds into another story of where we're all going about controlling people's views. But when I look at this two-tier system that they're creating, the two-tier politics, that is straight out of the book of communism. It's straight out of Stalinism. It's all about removing the elites who are in power then, the kings, the knights, the barons, whoever they may be, wherever they are in the world, and replacing them with our lot. Yep. Now, our lot gets the house. Our lot gets the car. Our lot gets the nice sinecure job and pension for the right. And you lot, who we said we were helping, you're still in the same place as you were before. And that's what the public's understanding. They realise it doesn't matter who's flipping over at the moment. We're still where we are. And we're not getting any better.
And at the end of the day, I think it's institutions matter, but people are in charge of institutions.
Yes.
So whether people now focus on institutions and the judiciary and the executive or any kind of branch, at the end of the days, who is going to be entrusted with guarding those institutions? Mm-hmm. And I think, for instance, people not constantly talk about the ECHR to say why people shouldn't be deported. The ECHR doesn't say people shouldn't be deported unconditionally.
No.
He doesn't say that.
Article 8, doesn't it? It gives you the opportunity to remove it. It gives you the chance to do so.
So it's people...
Look at Poland, for example. They did pretty well, didn't they, without any of that sort of stuff. And they're within the EU, and in many ways, they're doing much better than a lot of other European countries for it.
So, ladies and gentlemen, tell us whether you think that Labour actually has an issue with two-tier society or not. Thank you very much.
If you would like to watch the full uncut version that is also uncensored, head on over to lotuseaters.com to find out more.